I'm going to give you my take in a second. First, your reminder, if you want live updates like this one, if you want us reacting in real time to all the news, you have to head on over to dailywire.com/subscribe. And right now, 47% off with code FIGHT. Head on over there right now. Well, folks, that ends the vice presidential debate. So here is the immediate takeaway. J.D. Vance delivers one of the great debate performances that we've seen in modern history. Truly a stellar performance from J.D. Vance. And for all the people who believe that he was weird on the left, there was nothing weird about J.D. Vance's performance tonight. He looked not only cool and collected, he looked kind and empathetic. He delivered what I thought was a truly articulate defense of Donald Trump's policy positions. I may not agree with all those policy positions, but he delivered a very articulate defense of them. He presented an incredibly non-threatening face to the sort of Trump-Vance ticket. The goal for Tim Walz tonight was to make J.D. Vance look weird, was to make the Trump-Vance ticket look dangerous and scary. That's what they were intending to do. And J.D. Vance thwarted that by doing precisely the opposite. He played it cool. He played it low-key. He was very friendly to Tim Walz. At some points, I thought to myself, man, I wish he weren't quite so friendly to Tim Walz. I wish at some points he would jab Tim Walz a little bit harder. In fact, there were many times when the two of them would talk about how they were sort of agreeing with one another. But it was a very, very friendly debate from that perspective. That's very good for J.D. Vance, who, again, is trying to demonstrate to the American people that the Trump-Vance ticket is not chaotic, it is not volatile, it is not scary. It's some people that you can trust. Meanwhile, Tim Walz looked really awkward out there, particularly at the beginning of the debate. I think he picked up some steam later on in the debate when they got to domestic policy issues, on which there seemed to be both sides contending as to who could spend more. But at the very beginning, Tim Walz was stumbling and bumbling all over himself. You got a few cutaways that were pretty glorious of J.D. Vance giving the Jim Halpert from The Office to the camera. They're like, is this guy really saying what he seems to be saying? Tim Walz made a couple of gaffes that were particularly egregious. The one that is going to become the viral clip of the night is the one where he was asked about the fact that, like everything else in his record, he has fibbed about when he went to Tiananmen Square and where he was during Tiananmen Square. He had said that he was in Hong Kong. That isn't true. He's fibbed about nearly everything. J.D. Vance really didn't call him on a lot of that stuff. He's pretty kind in how he did call him on it. But Walz looked absolutely like a deer in the headlights to be even asked the question. He started rambling about how he had grown up in a poorer community. And then finally, he sort of stopped and said that he was a knucklehead. And then he stopped again and then suggested that he misspeaks frequently. It was a really bad look for him. And there was a lot of that tonight. He had these sort of awkward cadences, strange pauses. He looked bewildered. A lot of the time, he's kind of writing a lot of notes. He must have written a book tonight on that podium. He also looked extremely sort of bewildered as to why he was up there. Like big eyes, a lot of split screens that didn't look very good for Tim Walz. At this point, Kamala Harris has to be thinking, why didn't she pick Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania? We all know he was a Jew. She didn't pick Josh Shapiro for that reason. Shapiro certainly would have outperformed Tim Walz, who delivered what I thought was, at best, a mediocre performance. Probably the only good aspect of the night for Tim Walz came in that last sort of section where they were talking about January 6th, and Walz was trying to call J.D. Vance on January 6th. I don't think that means a lot to people. It was also at the very end of the debate. I don't think it scores a lot of points. For J.D. Vance, then, 10 out of 10 debate. For Tim Walz, like a 3 out of 10 debate. For the moderators, 0 out of 10. Again, terrible moderation. These moderators said going in, they were not going to do some sort of big fact-checking routine. There was a point during this debate where J.D. Vance suggested correctly that many of the people who are in Springfield, Ohio, are not legal immigrants. And he was talking about how they've been giving temporary protective status, which means that they didn't go through a green card process. And the fact-checkers tried to fact-check him and suggested these were all legal immigrants to the United States who were on the way to a green card. And he started correcting them. He said, no, that's not what, and they cut off the mics. So they'd said, we're not going to fact check you. We're going to let you fact check each other. Then they jumped into fact check. Every question was to Tim Walz, some sort of question about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and Donald Trump. And then they would go to J.D. Vance. And instead of asking him to respond to what Tim Walz had said, they would then ask him the single most inappropriate form of the question in an attempt to sort of cudgel him into a corner. So the moderators did quite a terrible job tonight. But J.D. Vance is a pro. He handled it extremely, extremely well. This does a few things for Donald Trump. The thing that it does, number one, for Donald Trump is, again, it quiets fears that this is a very volatile ticket. Number two, for J.D. Vance, it does a lot. J.D. is obviously looking beyond just 2024. He's super young. He's my age. J.D. is 40 years old, which means he's going to be at the center of American politics for years to come. This debate really enshrined that. The one thing that Vance didn't really do tonight, and I was hoping for him to do, was to really cast Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as radical. I don't think there was enough of that. I do think that Kamala Harris He banged on her about not getting things done, which again is a great approach. It's something that I've been recommending for a really long time. She is the current vice president of the United States. She is the person responsible for everything that is happening right now. And he really focused in on that. But I don't think that he really drew enough contrast as to just how radical Tim Walz is. I was sort of surprised that JD didn't bring up the fact that Tim Walz had said that socialism is just another name for friendliness. I'm sort of surprised they didn't bring up in more robust fashion Tim Walz's record on abortion. When he did bring it up, he brought it up almost half apologetically. And that brings me to sort of the final point that I have here, which is that when you listen to J.D. Vance's policies and where the Republican Party now is under Donald Trump, there have been some pretty significant shifts. I mean, J.D. Vance is a pro-life guy. His answers on abortion, however, were obvious dodges. I mean, he was obviously attempting not to answer his own positions with regard to abortion. I get that. I get it. He's running for the vice presidency. He has no intention, and Donald Trump has already said he has no intention of signing into law any sort of federal law with regard to abortion. But JD could have been much more aggressive in pushing back against Tim Walz with regard to abortion up until point of birth. He tried to do it, and then he sort of backed off a little bit. His answer was about how much sympathy and empathy he had for people who had abortions, which is fine if you then go to the next step and you say, but that still does not justify the end of a baby's life in the womb. Right? Like that is something that I think is sort of non-negotiable for a lot of Republicans and pro-life people, even if they plan on voting as I do for Trump and Vance. I also think that there's a lot of talk about federal spending. JD obviously is a much bigger government guy. I think it is fair to say after that particular debate that the era of semi-small government may be over. It's been over for quite a while. I didn't hear a lot of talk about cutting the size and scope of government in that debate. But again, that is really not on JD. That's really on Donald Trump and the platform that he's proposing. So, all in all, a very good night for JD Vance. Does it shift the nature of the race in any serious way? I don't think so. I think most people's opinions are set. But it does shift a lot of opinions about JD Vance going forward. Great night for JD Vance. Good night for the Trump-Vance ticket. Justifies Trump's pick of JD Vance in this race and really makes Kamala Harris look like a dunderhead for having picked Tim Walz.